Matt sat on the park bench, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon. The sky, a mix of purple and orange, seemed to mirror the internal storm raging inside him. At 25, Matt had lost his sense of direction. His life felt like a series of half-starts, of dreams abandoned too soon. He had dropped out of college to take care of his sick mother, and after she passed, he felt stranded, unsure of how to rebuild a future that seemed to have crumbled beneath him. As he sat lost in thought, he noticed a man shuffle toward the bench. The man looked old, far older than his years might have suggested. His clothes were worn, his face lined with deep wrinkles, but his eyes told a story of loss, regret, and maybe a glimmer of hope. The man sat down, not saying a word at first, but his presence was heavy, as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Minutes passed in silence, with neither acknowledging the other. Then, almost as if he couldn't contain it anymore, the man spoke, his voice low and raspy. "Funny thing about life," he said, not looking at Matt, "it can take everything from you when you're not paying attention." Matt turned to him, startled by the sudden intrusion of words. He hadn't expected anyone to break the silence. There was something haunting about the way the man spoke, something that hinted at a story worth hearing. "What do you mean?" Matt asked cautiously, unsure of what to expect from this stranger. The man finally looked at Matt, his eyes reflecting years of hardship. "Once, I had it all. A family, a business, a life most would envy. But a single mistake, a moment of weakness, and I lost it all." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Now, I'm just trying to find my way back." His voice wavered, as if admitting this was harder than anything he'd done in years. "My name's Arthur, by the way," he added, almost as an afterthought. Matt was silent, unsure how to respond to such a personal revelation from a stranger. Yet something about Arthur's story struck a chord deep within him. He introduced himself, but as the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he would talk to Arthur. Something about the man's story, about the deep sadness in his voice, pulled at Matt in ways he couldn't yet explain. Over the next few weeks, Matt and Arthur met regularly on the same park bench. What started as casual small talk slowly deepened into something more, a bond forged through shared pain and unspoken regrets. Arthur was an enigma, but the more Matt listened, the clearer the old man's story became. He had once owned a successful hardware store, a family business passed down through generations. It had been his pride, his legacy, something he had hoped to pass on to his daughter, Lucy. But life, as Arthur often said, had other plans. One evening, as they sat watching the trees sway in the breeze, Arthur opened up about his past in more detail. "It wasn't just the business that was taken from me," he said quietly. "I made a mistake. A big one. I trusted the wrong person." His voice was barely a whisper now, the memory clearly causing him pain. Arthur had trusted a close friend and business partner with a large financial decision. It was meant to be a sure thing, a way to expand the business and secure a future for his family. But the deal went south, and the fallout was catastrophic. He lost the store, his home, and worst of all, his connection with Lucy. She was in college at the time, and Arthur, ashamed of his failure, pushed her away. "I couldn't face her," he said. I thought it was better if she didn't see what I'd become." Matt felt a pang of sadness for Arthur. He knew too well what it was like to feel like a failure, to lose people because of decisions you couldn't undo. "Have you tried reaching out to her?" Matt asked. Arthur shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. "She probably hates me by now. It's been over a decade since we last spoke. Arthur's story unfolded like the slow peeling of an onion, layer after painful layer. He began to speak more about his relationship with Lucy, how close they had once been. "She was everything to me," Arthur would often say, his eyes clouding with distant memories. "I wasn't just her father. I was her friend. We used to spend weekends fixing things around the house, or she'd help out in the shop, learning the trade. I always thought I'd be the one to teach her everything I knew. But when the business collapsed, Arthur's pride wouldn't let him ask for help, not even from his daughter. He recounted the night he decided to sever ties. It was just after the store had officially gone bankrupt. Arthur had stood in the ruins of his once thriving business, too ashamed to face Lucy, too broken to ask for her forgiveness. "I told myself it was for her own good," Arthur whispered, the regret palpable in his voice. "I thought I could fix it, that I'd make things right and come back to her. But I never did." Matt's heart ached for Arthur, but he was also frustrated. "You're her father," Matt said one day, his voice rising slightly. "Don't you think she would have rather had you in her life, even if things were bad? You can't just abandon someone and think it's for their own good." Arthur looked down, nodding slightly. "You're right," he said softly. "But when you're in the thick of it, when everything's crumbling around you, you make choices. Sometimes they're the wrong ones." Matt couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. Arthur's story was haunting, but what disturbed Matt most was that the old man had simply accepted his fate. It was as if Arthur believed there was no chance of reconciliation, no hope left. But Matt didn't believe that. There had to be a way to find Lucy, to help Arthur rebuild the bridge he had burned so long ago. One evening, as they sat on the same park bench, Matt brought up the idea. "You should try to find her," he said. Arthur looked at him, surprised by the suggestion. "Lucy?" he asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "She wouldn't want to see me. Not after all these years." But Matt persisted. "You don't know that," he said. "You don't know how she feels now. People change. Time changes things. Maybe she's been waiting for you to reach out." Arthur was silent for a long time, staring off into the distance. Matt could see the wheels turning in his mind, the internal battle between hope and fear. "It's been so long," Arthur finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "What if she hates me?" Matt leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "What if she doesn't?" The search for Lucy began in earnest the very next day. Matt took the lead, scouring social media, reaching out to old friends and contacts who might know where she was. It wasn't easy. Lucy had moved several times since her last known address, and tracking her down felt like trying to find a needle in a haystack. But Matt was determined. He knew how important this was for Arthur, and in a way, it had become important to him too. Arthur, for his part, was a bundle of nerves. Every day that passed without a lead seemed to chip away at his hope. "Maybe this is a sign," he said one evening, his voice laced with defeat. "Maybe I'm not meant to find her." But Matt wasn't willing to give up. "You've come this far," he reminded Arthur. "We can't quit now." Finally, after weeks of searching, Matt found a possible lead. Lucy had taken a job in a nearby city and was working as a marketing executive for a small but successful company. When Matt told Arthur the news, the old man's face lit up with both excitement and fear. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling. Matt had no answer for him. All they could do now was reach out and hope for the best. Just as they were preparing to contact Lucy, Matt made an unexpected discovery. While helping Arthur clean out his tiny apartment, he stumbled upon an old, yellowed letter tucked away in a forgotten drawer. The envelope was sealed but never sent, and it was addressed to Lucy. Arthur had written it years ago, pouring out his heart, apologizing for pushing her away, and expressing his deep desire to make amends. "I couldn't send it," Arthur admitted, staring at the letter as if it were a ghost from his past. "I didn't have the courage. I wasn't sure if she would even care to read it." Matt read through the letter carefully, feeling the raw emotion in every word. It was clear that this letter held the key to bridging the gap between father and daughter. "You need to give this to her," Matt said firmly, handing the letter back to Arthur. At first, Arthur resisted, unsure if it was the right thing to do after so many years. But Matt's conviction swayed him. "If you really want to fix this, start by being honest," Matt said. Arthur finally nodded, agreeing to give Lucy the letter when they found her. The day came when Matt decided to deliver the letter himself. He found Lucy's office building, a sleek, modern structure that seemed worlds away from the humble life Arthur had described. Matt felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach as he entered the lobby, but he pushed forward. Lucy was not expecting him, and when he introduced himself as a friend of her father, her reaction was cold. "I haven't heard from my father in years," she said, her voice sharp. "I don't see why I'd start now." Matt's heart sank, but he didn't give up. He handed her the letter and said, "Just read it. If you don't want to talk to him after that, I'll understand. But at least hear him out." Lucy hesitated, glancing at the worn envelope as if it might burn her fingers, but eventually she took it. "I'll think about it," she said, before turning and walking away. Matt left the office with a heavy heart, unsure if Lucy would ever open the letter. He knew how much this meant to Arthur, and he hated the idea of returning with nothing but a vague promise. Still, there was nothing more he could do. It was in Lucy's hands now. When Matt returned to Arthur's apartment, he could see the hope and fear warring in the old man's eyes. "Did she say anything?" Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Matt shook his head. "She took the letter, but I don't know if she'll read it." Arthur's face fell, and he sank into his chair, staring at the floor. "I wouldn't blame her if she didn't," he said quietly. "After everything I did, I wouldn't blame her at all." Arthur opened up more about the decision that had led to his downfall. It wasn't just a financial mistake, it was a betrayal of the trust his family had placed in him. He had gambled their future on a risky investment, believing he could fix everything if it went wrong. But when it did go wrong, Arthur had been too ashamed to face his family, too proud to admit he needed help. "I thought I was protecting them," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "But all I did was push them away." Matt could see the pain etched on Arthur's face, the deep regret that had haunted him for years. "You made a mistake," Matt said gently. "But that doesn't mean you can't try to make it right now." Days turned into weeks, and there was no word from Lucy. Arthur began to lose hope, withdrawing into himself more with each passing day. Matt visited often, trying to keep his spirits up, but even he started to doubt whether Lucy would ever reach out. Then, one afternoon, Arthur's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, his breath caught in his throat. "Dad?" It was Lucy. She had read the letter. Her voice was hesitant, guarded, but there was a softness there that Arthur hadn't heard in years. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said, "but I'm willing to meet. We should talk." Arthur could barely find the words to respond, his emotions overwhelming him. "I'd like that," he managed to say, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'd really like that." When Matt arrived later that evening, he found Arthur pacing the apartment, a mixture of excitement and fear on his face. "She wants to meet," Arthur said, barely able to contain his emotions. "She actually wants to see me." The day of the meeting arrived, and Arthur was more nervous than he had been in his entire life. He spent the morning pacing around his small apartment, checking his reflection in the mirror, rehearsing what he would say to Lucy. But no matter how many times he practiced, nothing seemed to feel right. "What if I mess this up?" he asked Matt, his voice trembling with fear. "What if she never forgives me?" Matt stayed by his side, offering quiet reassurances. "You don't need to have all the right words," he told Arthur. "Just be honest. She's not expecting perfection. She just wants to hear the truth." Arthur nodded, though his hands still shook as he adjusted his tie. He had waited over a decade for this moment, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. "I just want her to know how sorry I am," he whispered. "I just want her to know that I never stopped loving her." Arthur sat at the small cafe table, his heart racing as he waited for Lucy to arrive. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each one filled with mounting tension. And then, there she was, walking through the door, her face unreadable, her movements confident but guarded. Arthur stood awkwardly, unsure whether to hug her, shake her hand, or simply sit back down. In the end, they exchanged a brief, awkward greeting before sitting across from each other, the silence between them heavy with years of unspoken words. Lucy was the first to speak. "Why now?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Why after all these years?" Arthur swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "Because I've spent every day regretting what I did," he said, his voice shaking. "I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was hurt you. I was too proud to ask for your forgiveness. I'm sorry, Lucy. I'm so sorry." For a long moment, Lucy said nothing. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something, perhaps sincerity, perhaps weakness. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said at last, her voice softening. "But I'm willing to try." It wasn't the full reconciliation Arthur had hoped for, but it was more than he had dared to dream. They left the cafe that day with a promise to keep trying, one small step at a time. As Arthur and Lucy took their first steps toward healing, Matt found himself reflecting on his own life. Arthur's journey had stirred something deep within him, an unresolved pain, a longing for a connection he had long since given up on. Matt had grown up without a father, and though he had told himself he didn't need the man who had abandoned him, a part of him still wondered if things could have been different. Inspired by Arthur's courage, Matt decided to reach out to his estranged father. It was a decision that filled him with equal parts hope and dread. He wrote a letter, much like the one Arthur had written to Lucy, explaining his feelings and asking for a chance to talk. He didn't expect a reply, but a week later, his phone rang. "Matt?" It was a voice he hadn't heard in over a decade. His father wanted to meet. The meeting was awkward, filled with long pauses and stilted conversation, but by the end, Matt felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They hadn't resolved everything, but they had taken the first step. As Matt left the cafe, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Arthur had taught him that it was never too late to try and mend what was broken. For Lucy, the decision to let her father back into her life wasn't easy. She had spent years building walls around her heart, telling herself that she didn't need him, that she was better off without the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. But after reading his letter, after sitting across from him at the cafe and hearing his apology, she realized that those walls were more fragile than she had thought. Still, the pain was real, and forgiveness didn't come easily. Lucy found herself torn between the desire to move on and the lingering resentment she still held. She confided in her best friend, who listened patiently and offered advice. "You don't have to forgive him all at once," her friend said. "But maybe you can start by letting him back into your life, even just a little." Lucy wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive, but she knew one thing: her father had changed. He wasn't the same man who had walked out of her life all those years ago. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to rebuild what had been lost. Arthur continued to reach out to Lucy, sending her small notes, sharing memories from her childhood, and slowly but surely, the distance between them began to shrink. One evening, Lucy invited Arthur to her apartment for dinner. It was a small gesture, but to Arthur, it meant everything. He arrived early, nervous but excited, and the evening passed in a blur of conversation, laughter, and the tentative rebuilding of their bond. As they sat together after dinner, sipping tea and reminiscing about the old days, Lucy felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The anger that had once consumed her was slowly being replaced by something else, something softer, more forgiving. "I'm still not ready to forgive everything," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "But I don't want to lose you again." Arthur's heart swelled with emotion. "You won't," he promised. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Months passed, and Arthur and Lucy's relationship continued to strengthen. They spent more time together, and the awkwardness that had once defined their interactions began to fade. Lucy even invited Arthur to join her for a family dinner, a small gathering with close friends and relatives. It was the first time in years that Arthur had been part of such an event, and though he felt out of place at first, by the end of the evening, he felt like he belonged. For the first time in over a decade, Arthur felt like he had a family again. The wounds between him and Lucy weren't fully healed, but they were well on their way. "I don't know what the future holds," Lucy said one evening as they sat together on her balcony, watching the stars. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give us a second chance." Arthur nodded, his heart full of hope. "That's all I ever wanted," he said softly. "A second chance." Inspired by Arthur's success, Matt continued to work on his relationship with his father. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like they were taking one step forward and two steps back. But with each conversation, with each meeting, the walls between them slowly began to come down. Matt realized that, like Arthur, his father had made mistakes that had cost them both dearly. But also like Arthur, his father was trying to make amends. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation, Matt found himself reflecting on everything Arthur had taught him. He realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of anger, it was about making a conscious decision to move forward, to rebuild. And though it wasn't always easy, it was always worth it. As Matt sat in his apartment that night, he made a decision. He was going to keep working on his relationship with his father, no matter how hard it got. Because in the end, family was worth fighting for. Arthur found new purpose in his life through volunteering at a local community center. He began working with other men who had lost their way, men who, like him, had made mistakes that had cost them their families. He shared his story, offering advice and encouragement to those who were struggling to rebuild their lives. For the first time in years, Arthur felt like he was making a difference. Matt, too, found a new sense of purpose. He began mentoring young men in his community, helping them navigate the challenges of life and offering guidance where he could. It was fulfilling work, and for the first time in a long time, Matt felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Together, Arthur and Matt had found a way to turn their pain into something meaningful, something that helped others. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was one that had made them both stronger. As Lucy spent more time with Arthur, she began to uncover parts of her own past that she had buried for years. She realized that the anger she had felt toward her father had been rooted not just in his abandonment, but in her own feelings of inadequacy. For years, she had blamed herself for his leaving, believing that if she had been a better daughter, he wouldn't have walked away. One evening, as they sat together in her living room, Lucy broke down in tears. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I blamed you for so many things, but I was really angry at myself." Arthur hugged her, his own eyes wet with tears. "We both made mistakes," he whispered. "But we can move forward now." It was a moment of mutual forgiveness, and it brought them closer than they had ever been. For the first time in years, Lucy felt like she could finally let go of the anger that had held her back for so long. The months that followed were filled with small but meaningful moments of healing. Arthur and Lucy continued to rebuild their relationship, spending more time together and slowly learning to trust each other again. One day, Lucy handed Arthur a letter, a heartfelt message thanking him for his efforts to mend their relationship and expressing her hope for the future. "I'm still not ready to forgive everything," the letter read. "But I'm ready to try. Thank you for never giving up on me." Arthur was moved to tears as he read the words. He had been given a gift he thought he'd lost forever, a chance to be a part of his daughter's life again. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. And for Arthur, that was enough. One day, Arthur received a phone call from Lucy, and her voice was filled with excitement. "Dad, I have some news," she said, barely able to contain her joy. "I'm pregnant. And we're naming him Arthur." Arthur was speechless. He had never expected such a gift, and the thought of his name living on through his grandson was overwhelming. When the baby was born, Arthur was the first to hold him. As he looked into the baby's eyes, he felt an indescribable sense of peace. His legacy would live on, not just through his name, but through the love and forgiveness that had brought him and Lucy back together. In that moment, Arthur realized that everything he had gone through, all the pain, all the regret, had led to this. His family was whole again, and his heart was full. After the birth of Lucy's son, Matt decided it was time to take the next step in his own life. He had always dreamed of leaving the small town where he had grown up, but fear and uncertainty had held him back. Now, with the weight of his past lifted, he felt ready. He packed his bags and moved to a new city, eager to start fresh and build a future that was entirely his own. Before he left, Matt visited Arthur one last time. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taught me more than I ever expected." Arthur smiled and handed Matt a small box. Inside was a watch, one that had belonged to Arthur's father. "Take this," Arthur said quietly. "It's a reminder that time is precious. Don't waste it." Matt nodded, deeply moved by the gesture. As he left Arthur's apartment, he felt a surge of hope and possibility. His future was wide open, and for the first time in years, he was excited about what lay ahead. As Matt settled into his new life in the city, he couldn't help but think back on the journey that had brought him here. Arthur's wisdom and guidance had changed his life in ways he hadn't even realized at the time. And though he missed the old man, he knew that their bond would never be broken. Meanwhile, Arthur's health began to decline. The years had taken their toll, and though his spirit remained strong, his body was growing weaker. In his final days, Arthur was surrounded by the people he loved, Lucy, her new baby, and Matt, who visited as often as he could. Arthur passed away peacefully, knowing that he had left a legacy of love and forgiveness behind. At Arthur's funeral, Matt and Lucy shared stories of the man who had touched their lives so deeply. They laughed, they cried, and they promised to carry on his legacy in everything they did. Arthur had taught them both the importance of family, of second chances, and of never giving up on the people you love. A few weeks after Arthur's death, Matt received a letter in the mail. It was from Arthur, written in the days before he passed. The letter was short, but its message was clear. "Matt," it read, "you were like a son to me. Thank you for being there when I needed you most. I hope you find everything you're looking for in life. Don't be afraid to take chances. Love, Arthur." Matt sat down, tears streaming down his face as he read the words. Arthur had given him more than just advice. He had given him the courage to live his life fully, without fear or regret. And now, as Matt faced his future, he knew that Arthur's legacy would live on through him. In his new city, Matt quickly found his footing. He got a job at a local nonprofit, working with young men who, like him, had grown up without strong father figures. It was fulfilling work, and for the first time in his life, Matt felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Every now and then, Matt would think back to the days he had spent with Arthur, sitting on that park bench, talking about life and loss. He knew that without Arthur, he wouldn't be where he was today. And though they were miles apart, Matt felt a deep sense of connection to the man who had become like a father to him. A year later, Matt returned to visit Lucy and her family. It was a bittersweet visit, filled with memories of Arthur, but also with hope for the future. Lucy's son, Arthur's namesake, had grown into a bright, happy toddler, and Matt couldn't help but smile as he watched the child play. As they sat together in Lucy's living room, Matt felt a sense of peace wash over him. Arthur's legacy had lived on, not just through his name, but through the love and forgiveness that had healed their family. "He would be so proud of you," Matt said quietly, and Lucy nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "He would be proud of both of us," she replied, her voice soft but steady. Arthur's memory lingered long after his death. For Matt, the lessons he had learned from the old man shaped every decision he made. He carried Arthur's watch with him everywhere, a constant reminder of the importance of time and the need to make the most of it. One day, as Matt stood at Arthur's grave, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since they first met. Arthur had been a stranger at first, but he had become a mentor, a friend, and in many ways, a father figure. Matt felt a deep sense of gratitude for the time they had spent together and for the lessons that had shaped his life. "I'll keep your legacy alive," Matt whispered, placing a hand on the gravestone. "I'll make sure your story doesn't end here." In the years that followed, Matt continued to carry Arthur's lessons with him. He became a mentor to others, offering guidance and support to young men who were struggling to find their way. And though his own life was busy and full, he always made time for the people who mattered most. Lucy, too, carried on Arthur's legacy. She raised her son with the values her father had taught her: kindness, forgiveness, and the importance of family. And as the years passed, she found herself thinking more and more about the lessons she had learned from both her father and Matt. Together, they had built something beautiful: a family, a legacy, and a future filled with love and hope. Years later, Matt found himself back at the park where it had all begun. He sat on the same bench where he had first met Arthur, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. So much had changed since that fateful day, but the lessons Arthur had taught him remained constant. As he sat there, watching the sunset, Matt realized that Arthur's legacy would live on, not just through him, but through every life he had touched. It was a legacy of love, forgiveness, and second chances, passed down from one generation to the next. And as Matt stood up to leave, he smiled, knowing that the journey was far from over. Lucy's son, Arthur, grew up surrounded by stories of his grandfather's wisdom and love. As he got older, Lucy made sure to teach him the values that had been so important to her father: kindness, forgiveness, and the importance of family. Arthur's name became a symbol of the love that had healed a once broken family. Meanwhile, Matt continued to thrive in his new life. He had become a pillar of his community, mentoring young men and helping them find their own paths. Every now and then, he would think back to Arthur, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. As Matt reached his 40s, he found himself mentoring a young man who reminded him of his younger self, lost, unsure, and looking for guidance. As he shared the lessons he had learned from Arthur, Matt realized that the journey of love, forgiveness, and healing was never truly over. It was a journey that continued with each new generation, passed down from one person to the next. As Matt walked away from the park where he had first met Arthur, he smiled, knowing that Arthur's legacy would live on, not just through him, but through everyone whose lives had been touched by the power of love and second chances. And so, the journey continued, full of hope and possibility.